Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of a double bill today and the last show for this week. And next week, it's all back to Norway and Denmark again. So make a note of those shows. They'll all be fantastic. Anyway, right now we are talking POWs again. And Dallas yesterday and Richard earlier set the scene very much. But now Maier Rowe-McCulloch, who will expand on the subject. This is the last show, as I say, we're doing this week. That is all part of the book, The German-Soviet War, which there are links to in the description below. We've got another week coming up, the one after next, with more guests who are contributors to that book. But I'll bring my guests in now. Good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Very well. So my first question is, how did you end up contributing to the book? It seems that Jeff has got a pretty good, extensive network of historians, but how did you get involved?
I would say he sure does, yeah. So I've known Jeff's work for a while, and I was a graduate student. I was using his published work to do my own research. And then he and Ed Westerman together ran a seminar at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum about Soviet prisoners of war, basically saying, like, this is what we all know. It's not much. Sure would be nice if we knew more. And I, from the research I was doing at the time, knew a little bit about one region and knew a little bit of stuff about it. And so when the book came around, he contacted me and asked if I'd be interested in contributing. And I think it was because they were interested in getting some more people who work with Soviet sources, who use Russian language material to contribute. And so that's the perspective that I can bring.
Brilliant stuff. Well, we'll bring up your slides. And folks, as always, you are welcome to jump in with comments and questions. But I'm going to hand over to my guest to take us through this. So, subject we've kind of delved into before, but I'm really looking forward to your perspective. So over to you.
Thank you very much. All right. So hi, everyone. My name is Maier Rowe-McCulloch. I'll just say I'm an assistant professor at the University of Regina, which is in Saskatchewan, right in the middle of Canada. And I research the history of World War II and the Holocaust as it unfolded on the territory of the Soviet Union. So I'm a Soviet historian who's also I also use German materials. I'm interested in trying to look at this like German occupied part of the USSR. And when I started doing research, my first project, which I'm just sort of turning into a book right now and finishing, is about a city called Rostov-on-Don in the south of Russia, which was occupied 2 separate times during the war. And as I was researching that, part of what I discovered was material about how Soviet prisoners of war were treated or mistreated. And so having finished that project, that was a question that I really wanted to understand better. I really wanted to know more about Soviet POWs. And it remains in all the fields I deal with, in World War II, history of the Soviet Union, history of the Holocaust. The question of how do Soviet POWs fit in, what happened to them, is sort of well known as this subject that we just don't know that much about.
Right.
And so I am now working on a new book where I'm trying to better understand that. And my chapter in Jeff's book is sort of a starting point for that. So I'm going to talk today about some of the sort of the basics, which will probably be review for some of the people in the audience, some of the basics of what happened to Soviet POWs. And I'm going to try and talk through particularly what it was like to be a Soviet POW in some of these German-run camps that they ended up in. And then I'm going to try and end off by diving a little deeper into this question of why don't we know more? Why are we in the 2020s now and we still don't know a lot about this particular group, which was a large group and was subjected to a lot of atrocities by the Germans. So to start with that, to set the scene, I just like to bring up some of the numbers. So 5.7 million Soviet soldiers of the Red Army, were taken as prisoners of war by Axis forces between 1941 and 1945. Out of that number, an estimated 3.3 million of them died in captivity, which gives us a death rate of about 57%, which is staggeringly high when we compare it to what was going on in other parts of the European theater of war. So, for example, Western Allied troops who end up in German POW camps they die at a rate of closer to like 3.5%. The next highest comparison that we've got, again, within the European field, would be the reverse of the Soviet experience. So German soldiers captured, held in Soviet prisoner of war camps. And I think the best estimates we've got today are the death rate for those German POWs is somewhere around 33%. So that already way higher than the like 3.5% number. That's still an enormous number of people. However, that 33% rate is approaching half, again, the number of Soviet POWs who die. So like, it's an enormous number that die in Soviet hands, and it's still way lower than the number of Soviets who die in German hands. So why? What is going on that makes Soviet prisoners of war die so much more than any other POWs during the war? And the simple answer, I think, for that is German ideology. Like, basically, it is not accidental. It is the direct result of choices and policies that the Wehrmacht carries out, some of which are choices that are made before the invasion has even begun. And so it's not just sort of practical limitations, it's decisions. And those decisions are very much informed by the Nazi worldview, the Nazi ideology that is, running the government at the time. And it also has, for years before the war even started, informed the German military. So one thing I'll note that I like to point out when I talk about this is the myth of the clean Wehrmacht is something I'm sure people are familiar with. We haven't been talking about the Wehrmacht as clean, as sort of like just like any other conscript-based army, behaving the same kind of way for a while. But I think if there's any one moment in the war, any one thing we can point to that really challenges this myth, it would be looking at the treatment of Soviet POWs. Because unlike most of the other groups who are subjected to atrocities by the Germans during World War II, Soviet prisoners of war are supposed to be, from the moment they're captured to the end of the war, the responsibility of the Wehrmacht. It's the Wehrmacht's job to take care of them and keep them alive. And so the fact that such an enormous number die is a direct reflection on the Wehrmacht. Even if it's not the Wehrmacht who's always killing them, they were supposed to keep them safe, and they clearly did not. So I think that's one of the reasons, if we want to better understand the German military, it's really important to understand this. From the Soviet side, it's just, these are so many Soviet people that we really should better understand. So yeah, as I said, the Nazi worldview influenced a lot of choices that the German military made that directly shape how Soviet prisoners of war were treated. That in turn leads to this mass death. I'll single out in particular a sort of a shared view that the German military already had going for it before 1933, before the Nazis even take power, but which only gets amplified and encouraged once the Nazis are in power, would be anti-communism. There was a big fear of communism across Europe after the Soviet Union is formed, a fear that, it will spread and take over other places. And the German military, I think, was already worried about this, at least, high-ranking people. And then the Nazis come along and they're very anti-communist. And so this sort of is a point of cooperation or collaboration where even if not everyone in the military is on board with all of Hitler's stuff, they can really get behind the anti-communism stuff. And so, again, because of the Nazi worldview, anti-communism soon gets packaged along with anti-Judaism, and we get this idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, that like communism is infected by Judaism in a fundamental way, but also that like all Jews are probably communists. And so these kind of ideas, which the Wehrmacht, at least leadership, does seem to have largely bought into or was open to, I think, go quite a long way to explaining some of the decisions that they're willing to make, some of the reasons that their treatment of prisoners in the Soviet Union is different from even what they're doing in Poland, which was already not great. So they think about the soldiers that they're going to capture, the soldiers of the Red Army, as inherently communist. And that shapes a lot of the choices they make when they think about, well, how are we going to fight a war against the people of this country? And so some of the military planning and the more general German planning that goes into Operation Barbarossa, goes into like thinking about what will come after we invade the country, sets up the Wehrmacht to be in a situation where it's not going to be treating prisoners well. So two of the main things I just want to call out. First, there is a thing called Hungerplan Ost, where the Germans sort of plan for once we run parts of the Soviet Union, how are we going to administer it? And there's an acknowledgement made in this plan that's being written before the invasion that, well, we're going to want to seize a lot of food. We're going to want to ship that food to Germany to feed other parts of the Reich. But that's going to mean people are going to die. Like, people are going to starve to death if we take that food. And they openly write that out in their plan. And they're building that into the structure of what they expect to do. So large-scale starvation of Soviet people is expected. And as it turns out, Soviet prisoners of war end up on the front lines of that. Like, they become the number one group or I should say maybe the last group on the list that's going to get fed. So they really suffer from that, which again, totally not just anticipated, but, planned for by the Germans. And then also, before the invasion has begun, the German military issues a series of orders that we talk about today as the criminal orders. That's not what the Germans called them, of course. But they issue these 3 orders in late May, early June 1941, right before they go in to the Soviet Union. And these orders basically are passed down to German soldiers, telling them, once you get into the Soviet Union, fighting will be different. We will have different expectations. Yeah. And so the things that I would pick out of the criminal orders that I think are relevant here are, one of them talks about how military justice will be different, and basically, like, officers will be able to carry out, to order executions. Summary military justice will be allowed for civilians as well as for enemy soldiers, which is not standard in other places that they've gone into. These orders also inform the German soldiers. Acts of bad behavior, things that were considered breaking the law in other places, will not be punished in the Soviet Union as long as military discipline is not disrupted. And the things they call out include looting and rape. So they are basically telling their soldiers, you will be allowed to do that in the Soviet Union and we won't punish you for it. Again, as long as you listen to your commanding officer when you're told to do something. So again, clearly they are setting up the expectation for their soldiers that we are not going to treat the people of the Soviet Union the same way we've been treating other people. And this is all informed by a worldview, a racialized conception of Soviet people as communist, as less valuable, etc.
Without derailing you too much.
Yes.
Is there a slight hierarchy within how they will treat the people of the Soviet Union? Because it's a big, large area. So, Ukrainians, Estonians, is there a hierarchy, or is it basically if they're in a Red Army uniform, they're all the same?
Absolutely. That's a great question. The answer is yes, there is going to be a hierarchy. It's very much based on race. And so, although in propaganda, the Germans talk about the Soviet Union as being a land of Slavs, in practice, they understand that it's a multi-ethnic empire, and they have a clear ranking, a clear hierarchy in their mind of who is a potential collaborator partner that they would be willing to work with, and who is low on the list, who is a threat that should be eliminated. So, unsurprisingly, the very bottom of the list in terms of, how they think of the ranks of races would be Jews.
Yeah.
And then close behind would be Sinti and Roma, with the group the Germans would have called gypsies. And those people are going to be among the first to be killed, whether they're in a Red Army uniform or not. At the top of the list, as you just cited, people from the Baltic states. The Baltics have only been incorporated in the Soviet Union at this point for like a year and a bit. They were stolen, forcibly annexed by the Soviets. But yeah, if you're Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, you're not going to get treated the same as a Slavic person. The Germans are definitely open to like some potential working together there. Even within the realm of Slavs, however, although again, they like to talk about Slavs in propaganda as if they're all one group. In practice, Russians are seen as the worst. So Russians are way low down on the list. Belarusians a little above. Then there are non-Slavic groups that, of course, exist in the Soviet Union. And again, the Germans don't see them all the same. People from Central Asia, so Kazakh, Uzbek, Tajik, Kyrgyz, etc. people who, of course, could be recruited, could end up in the Red Army. They are generally talked about using very unflattering language, Asiatic, Mongol. They are not racial groups that the Germans have any interest in working with usually. They're probably going to be they're going to have a bad time if they encounter the Germans. But people from the Caucasus, who the Germans tended to refer to as a group as Turkfolk, or like Turkic people, Caucasians is how we would say it in English. But Georgians, Armenians, people from Azerbaijan, and Crimean Tatars, they are surprisingly open to working with. They see these people as potential partners as well. So there's a whole lot of gradation going on. And I sort of saved for last, perhaps surprisingly high on the list are Ukrainians. Ukrainians also clearly Slavic people, if the concept of Slavic people means anything. But when the Germans arrive, there's a lot of talk about like, wow, lots of people have blonde hair in Ukraine. And they find, for political reasons, a lot of dissatisfied Ukrainians. There's a lot of unrequited nationalism. People really hate Stalin in a lot of parts of Ukraine. People are like open to working with the Germans, in not all cases, but in some cases, to sort of shake off the Soviet leadership. And so the Germans start to think like, oh, maybe we should do some racial recalculation. Are we sure that we really hate Ukrainians? Because they'd be a really convenient partner. And so I would say as the war goes on, Ukrainians, I think, drop on the list and they sort of lose some of their privilege. But early on, it makes a big difference. If the Germans understand you as Ukrainian versus Russian, like you will not get the same treatment. And this is something I'll talk a bit more about when I talk about some of the sort of differences. But yeah, it's a really important point.
Thank
that you. Ideologically, because everything is filtered through this view of race in the German mindset, that they are quite obsessive about how they racially categorize the Soviet people they encounter. And they dislike a lot of them or hate a lot of them, but they don't necessarily hate them exactly equally. So the last of the criminal orders that I want to call out is probably the most relevant for what I'm going to talk about, that is the Commissar order. And this is the order that basically says, when we get into the Soviet Union, if you capture an enemy combatant who is a commissar or a politruk, which are basically terms that the Germans use for ranks in the Soviet army that are particularly likely to be held by diehard communists, or in the case of the like political officers, their job in the army is to educate other soldiers about communism. So these are like the most communist of the soldiers. The Commissar order says, we're not going to take those people as prisoners. You can shoot them on sight. What the order doesn't spell out, but what is implied from the beginning, and we know this because of how it's carried out, is because of the existing ideas about how Jews are communists and communists are Jews, is any Jewish soldier can be considered a commissar. And so any Jewish soldier of the Red Army who's captured can also be immediately shot on sight. And that is what happens to the majority of Jewish POWs in the Red Army. So again, these are orders that are passed down before the invasion has even begun. So the reason I want to stress that is sometimes when the Germans would talk about these things, although they didn't like to, sometimes the approach was like, well, we had to be brutal in the Soviet Union in response to the brutal fighting we encountered from Red Army soldiers. But the fact that these plans are being made before the invasion's even begun, I think should show us that that's not what's going on here. They're not reacting. They are deciding in advance, we're going to be brutal in the Soviet Union. And I'll also note, I think for anyone who knows anything about the laws of war, it will already be clear. But I just want to spell out that with these criminal orders, the Wehrmacht is explicitly telling its soldiers, we are not going to follow the Geneva Conventions in the Soviet Union. And I will say, a thing that sometimes gets brought up is, well, the thing the Germans like to bring up at the time is, well, the Soviets were not signatories to the Geneva Convention.
Indeed.
However, the Geneva Convention binds everyone who is a signatory to follow the laws of war. So when you sign the Geneva Conventions, you promise, I will fight this way when I fight a war. And it is not supposed to matter what your enemy is doing. The Germans were signatories to the Geneva Convention. So they are the ones who are bound. They are supposed to be behaving a certain way. And here they're saying they're not. If we, going behind the scenes, Stalin at this time is talking about how the Soviets should be trying to follow the Geneva Conventions, even though they're not signatories to it, in part because he feared exactly this. He feared that if they don't behave well, that will invite bad treatment from the other armies. So the Soviets are not planning to fight in a particularly underhanded way. They're planning to basically do the Geneva Conventions anyway when this thing starts. So that's what I want to say about German ideology, to just sort of set us up. So when the invasion happens, it goes quite poorly for the Soviets early on. They are caught by surprise, despite lots of reasons they shouldn't have been, but they are caught by surprise. And there is a really rapid invasion into the country. They lose large swaths of territory in the first weeks and months of the war. And that means literally millions of Soviet soldiers get captured pretty quickly and fall into German hands, become POWs. Some of those, thinking about the Commissar order, some of those are killed almost immediately. The majority of those soldiers who are captured in the first weeks and months of the war are instead put into prisoner of war camps that are set up on the territory the Germans now control, which the Germans, by the way, call the occupied Soviet territories. So that's why I've capitalized. That's what I'm referring to. Mm-hmm. Within these occupied territories, there are two kinds of camps that the Germans set up. Basically, there are Gulags and Stalags, which are shortened versions of longer German words that mean transit camps and like stationary camps. Gulags, transit camps, Stalags are stationary camps. In other places, there would be a third kind of camp, like other places where the Germans have invaded. There would also be Auflags or officers' camps. They don't really do that in the Soviet Union. There aren't necessarily zero Auflags that they ever set up, but systematically, they don't set them up. They don't single out officers for different treatment when it comes to Soviet POWs, which again, the Geneva Convention says they're supposed to, but they don't. So everyone ends up usually you're first in a transit camp, and then after a bit of time has passed, you'll get sort of relocated, passed along to a more stable stationary camp. Many of these camps, especially early on, are camps in name only. So I'm going to start. I've got some pictures I want to show as I keep talking. So I'll say, first of all, a reoccurring image that we see if we look at German photographs. So German soldiers bring cameras with them on the front lines. Lots of them take photos, like kind of tourist pictures of this adventure they're going on. And it's quite common if they take pictures early in the war of POWs to see this kind of photo, like huge, long columns of captured prisoners. So this is one of the ways that we know from the number of losses, but we get a sense of like how many soldiers the Germans have taken into their care. And so one of the things that the Germans didn't do in the lead up to the invasion is make concrete plans for what they were going to do with these soldiers once they get them. although they anticipate they could capture up to like 2 million soldiers in the first 6 weeks of the war in their planning. They can't claim to be surprised by that kind of rate of capture. And yet they make the choice that they don't set up a system. They don't set up plans for what to do with them. And so what ends up happening is these huge numbers of Soviet POWs are just crowded together in a lot of cases into any space the Germans can find. And in many cases, it's open fields. Sometimes they put barbed wire up around the field to sort of contain the prisoners. But in a lot of cases, there are just like tens of thousands of captured soldiers being held out in the open, or the Germans will requisition and take over existing buildings that aren't necessarily fit for human habitation, stables. They like artillery training schools or like existing military infrastructure they can take from the Soviets. But in a lot of cases, they're taking over buildings they can find, or if they can't find any, it's just fields. They're crowding these people together and they are leaving them there for weeks and then months.
I'm glad you just clarified that what is a camp, because, you know, just very briefly, we did a show earlier this week with Nicholas about his father captured in Italy as a British POW, and their prisoner of war camp was a building with a bar, and but it's still a POW camp in the terms of how it's listed on Google. But you're making the clear understand there's camps and there's camps, and it's that nuance of language is so important.
Yeah, the Germans were calling things camps that have no physical infrastructure to begin with. Yeah. So as time went on, the prisoners themselves often are forced to, or for their own sake, try to build some infrastructure. So we can see here in my sort of second picture, they're like digging out like sleeping places from the ground. This is a thing that happens. Also, in some cases here, we've got a more formal dugout. So the Germans often put these prisoners to work building their own accommodation or repairing accommodation if they're in a bad place, or like a broken place, I should say. But even so, just crowding that many people together and forcing them to stay together becomes a huge problem, because these conditions are fabulous for the spread of disease.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, so if we look, this other picture I have here is an example of a camp created near Minsk. And I'm not sure that it's the same camp. It's hard to match photos or hard to know the location of a lot of these photos exactly. But there is one notable camp created in Minsk in the summer of 1941, which ends up reaching a population of 100,000 POWs crowded together in this one field. And so if we think about being a German trying to run a camp like that, I think it's pretty obvious you're going to have an incredibly hard time distributing food to all these people. You're going to have an incredibly hard time getting together enough food to feed 100,000 people, especially if part of your plans for this invasion where we're going to ship a lot of the food we find back home to Germany. But also sanitary facilities. Like, this is an outdoor space. Where are the toilets? Where do you go to the bathroom? Where do you bathe? You don't. Or, you do it in an unsanitary manner because there's no other choice. Also, some of the people who are being brought in as POWs are wounded. So there's medical problems, but then also people quickly get sick. And one of the unfortunate reinforcing realities of captivity is there isn't enough food. So starvation becomes a problem really quickly. And then starving people's bodies, their immune system deteriorates really fast, which is a perfect situation if you've crowded a lot of those people together for spreads of disease. So it's all sort of self-reinforcing. There's too many people. There's not enough shelter. There isn't enough food. There's lice spreading because they can't take a bath. And so starvation and epidemic disease become the biggest killers in most of these situations. But also, this is a hard situation in the summer of 1941 when the war starts. But a lot of these camps continue to exist into the autumn and the winter of 1941, into the winter of 1942. So Russian winters, so Soviet winters are very cold. It is not a time you want to be outdoors unprotected. And so when cold gets added, people are freezing to death. Frostbite's a huge issue. And there's just all of these layers of different sources of suffering that compound one another.
So just for clarification, sorry to interrupt you again.
Yeah.
When you say there's no provision made for this, they know the scale, they know the volume that they're going to be getting if the plan goes as the military plan goes well. You say they've made no provision. Have they made no provision, or have they thought about it and dismissed it because they don't care? I mean, has there been like a meeting where someone has said, well, what's going to happen with the sanitation? And they've gone, well, we don't care. So is it, what's the answer?
A good question. Is this sort of intentional, like, is this neglect? Is this an accident? I'd say that the easiest way to answer that is to say, we don't know for sure.
Right.
I'll talk about this a bit more at the end, but
okay, thank you.
There's just a huge shortage of sources on the German side. A lot of stuff gets destroyed at the end of the war. And so it is hard to piece together the exact decision-making process on the German side. But it seems to me that a lot of this reflects sort of an awareness of like, oh, we're probably going to have to deal with that at some point. And then like people just leave it at that. They sort of don't want to openly say, oh, well, we look forward to having a lot of people dying around us. And they also don't say, well, we got to do something about that to deal with it. So
yeah. Just because, I know because of collecting military manuals over the years, engineer officers, infantry officers, routinely, Soviet, German, British, American, Australian, for decades, centuries would have, here's how to look after groups of people. You have to get this sort of sanitation in place. You have to have this. It's just been a standard military thing, probably going back to the Crusades, that when you put volumes of people together, whether they're your own people or captured people, you will need to have some sort of engineering infrastructure. So anybody who's on the periphery of this, who's a military officer, would have some understanding that this, like the no shit Sherlock, of course you're going to get these problems. I mean, if you put this number of people together, of course it's going to happen. So
precisely, yeah. So again, it doesn't make sense to talk about this as like an unanticipatable outcome.
Yeah.
That we think would be insulting to the intelligence of the Germans who are running this army. What I can say is the people who are assigned to run the camps are usually soldiers in unit, or they're soldiers who can't be sent to the front lines. They're often these units of like older soldiers. So they're choosing soldiers they consider kind of expendable or not that useful to be placed in charge of these camps. And they're not giving a very high number of soldiers to run these POW camps. And so they are setting up scenario. And then I would, on a sort of day-to-day level, they're putting it on those units and saying like, you figure it out, you got to get them some food. So just like requisition some food from the local area. I don't know, you figure it out. Which is very much setting up a scenario where success is unlikely. Yeah. But I think they're passing the buck in a lot of cases.
Okay, thank you. I'll let you go. I won't interrupt for a bit.
That's okay. No, I'm always happy to answer. So that was what I was going to sort of end by saying this section by sort of saying, they that these special German units, Landesschützen, are often who's doing the guarding, but they also draw on local collaborators. They try and get local recruits to help them because they know they don't have enough people. So it's this sort of infrastructure of a small number of Germans working with some local Soviet people. They brought in as collaborators who end up guarding the camps. And because of the huge numbers, because of how hungry everyone is, in order to keep people in line, a lot of violence has to be used in these camps. And in the few surviving German reports we have, like they're saying this openly, related to that camp in Minsk that was 100,000 people at one point. There's a report sent back to Berlin that's just like, this is how many people we have. Like, of course we have to use terrible violence every day to keep the prisoners under control. Like they're just saying openly, like, I don't know what you want us to do, but this is what we're doing because what else could possibly be the outcome? So the result of, so what I wanted to say connected to that is in addition to all the ways Soviet soldiers are suffering from neglect and a sort of a passive allowing them to die. There's also a lot of violence being used to try and keep them in line. This photo here is one that I found that shows there are these like punishment cages set up in some camps. I've seen other photos taken again as like souvenirs by soldiers that show Soviet POWs tied to the barbed wire around camps, we can assume as punishment for something. So it's a really brutal and harsh environment within the camps. Just for some perspective on how bad the food rations could get, there's a POW camp set up in the Ukrainian town of Sumy, and a Soviet prisoner of war who actually survives, a guy whose last name is Vyakish, he describes to the Soviets when he's released what it was like there. And he says that the prisoners got between 200 and 300 grams of black bread every day and a single serving of soup. And the soup was made from the waste products of vegetables that had already been cooked by the Germans. So in terms of calories, a tiny fraction of what a person would need to survive. And an unfortunate reality that I've heard about in multiple sources is that starvation is so rampant, people were so hungry in these camps that there are multiple instances of still living prisoners being mistaken for corpses and being like taken to be buried along with dead prisoners because they were so weak that people like just thought they were already dead. So here I have found, this is an interesting source, I think. It says artwork created by two Soviet POWs who survived their time in camps. And one of the things, they were artists before they went in, before they were recruited into the army, actually. And so they both did sketches to sort of try and communicate what it was like to be in these camps. And both of these artists single out food distribution as a particularly violent time. Like that's when the Germans really need to try and control everyone. So it's a violent moment when you're getting your soup. But also one of the artists drew this picture where he's sort of depicting this moment. He's saying like they're carrying this what they think is a corpse of a Soviet prisoner of war to dump him on a pile of corpses. And then he sits up and goes, "Oh, I'm not dead yet, actually," which reflects a real thing that happened. The artist sort of writes in an accompanying text about how he'd seen this happen. And I've heard about that from other camps as well. So the prisoners are really, really just reduced to nothing. And although these camps, theoretically, many of them have a hospital wing or a lazaret, like a field hospital section. It's basically just like an isolation section. There is almost no medication available. There's no treatment that can be offered. And it's fellow Soviet POWs with medical training who are operating it. The Germans are almost never sending in doctors to do anything. So in all these ways, the camps are really, really brutal. And so unsurprisingly, we get huge numbers of deaths coming out of these camps. I will say that the deaths are not spread equally across the whole war. The first winter is particularly terrible. After that, mid-1942, there's a bit of a shift in German policy. They start to value Soviet POWs a little more as potential laborers. So they tend to feed them a little better, care a little bit more about keeping them alive. So things improve somewhat, but not that much. Everything I've just been talking about is sort of a good example of suffering that's happening through neglect, or I sometimes talk about it as weaponized neglect. Like it's very much intentional, but it's this stepping back and like, we're not going to interfere. But that's not the only thing that's happening. In addition to that, there are also outright executions of prisoners of war that happen. They are most common during periods of invasion or capture. So again, early on connected to the Commissar order. But actually, this behavior becomes so ingrained. The Commissar order is officially revoked in May of 1942. But the Wehrmacht doesn't necessarily stop killing, or at least handing over to be killed, Soviet POWs that they don't like, even after that. So I know, like my first project, I looked at the city of Rostov-on-Don. It's recaptured in July of 1942. There's a mass killing of Soviet POWs immediately after. That's not supposed to happen apparently anymore, but it sure is. So that's happening during invasions, but also during retreats. That's a real moment of danger for Soviet POWs in sort of two main ways. Sick or injured POWs who can't continue to labor for the Germans are left behind. But in some cases, they don't just abandon them. They like gather together groups of sick POWs and they execute them right before they leave. In other cases, the soldiers who are healthy enough, the Germans feel, to bring along, they make them march long distances. And if the soldiers can't keep up, they will shoot anyone who's falling behind. While at the same time, like this is happening in the middle of winters. This is happening when they're not giving them enough food. So a lot of people will fall behind. And Soviet sources refer to some of these forced marches of prisoners as death marches. So today, when we talk about death marches, it's generally associated with a particular moment at the end of the war in the Holocaust. But the Soviets actually use this term already as 1943. They've seen some of these marches that they think of as death marches, where like 50% of the POWs who set out don't reach their destination. So this is what I want to say about Soviets as victims of atrocities. And then there's a couple more things I want to say. I'll try and go a little quicker. So connected to what we talked about earlier, because the Germans are really obsessed with sorting populations under their control, thinking in terms of race, thinking in terms of what makes people different, and treating them differently as a result, not every Soviet POW who ends up in German captivity is going to have the same experience. And I think it's really important to say that. The majority are going to have a terrible time. Some are going to have the worst time. If you're Jewish, if you're a commissar, like your chances of surviving even a few days in captivity are super low. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you're Latvian, if you're Estonian, and if you're asked, do you want to like leave a POW camp and come work with the Germans? And you say yes, you might only spend a few days in one of these camps. So how the Germans perceived your race plays a big role in what your experience will be. Another thing that matters is gender, and something I haven't really talked about yet, but something that is distinct about the Red Army is that women serve in the Red Army.
Yeah, of course.
Somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million women fight in the Red Army, about half of them in frontline positions, which means some of those Soviet POWs who are captured were women. Unfortunately, we know very little about what happened to these women. This is like a mystery within a mystery. It's a really poorly understood situation. But the best understanding we have right now seems to be that these women usually don't end up in POW camps. So they are probably also being executed almost immediately, like on the spot. What we do know is, going back to German ideology, the Germans think that this is perverse, that the Soviets let women fight in the military. They do not acknowledge that these people are real soldiers. And so they don't acknowledge that they owe any of the protections of normal soldiers to these women. So sometimes it seems like these captured female Soviet POWs got sent into the concentration camp system. In other cases, I've seen, perhaps they get sent to local prisons or treated like they are partisans, like guerrilla fighters, because even though they're members of the military in uniform, the Germans won't accept that. So they're like, okay, you're fighting, you have a gun, but you're not supposed to be a soldier, so you must be this other thing. And then the third outcome seems to be, or they were killed. So gender plays a big role here. And then sort of the third factor that would shape what kind of an experience you could hope to have in a POW camp, if you're Soviet, was what's your work experience? Because there are certain things the Germans are really desperate for. And whatever your racial background was, they seemed open to potentially collaborating with you if you were like a chemical engineer, if you knew something about oil drilling. Like they're really desperate to get certain parts of the Soviet economy back up and running. And so they're open to like potentially recruiting from POW camps people who had certain work experience. So what would happen from the Soviet prisoner perspective is there are these sortings that would happen in camps. The Germans are trying to figure out, who are you, based on categories that matter to them. What's your race? Like, what language do you speak, etc. And then what could happen is you could be invited to leave a POW camp and be recruited into the German system, either to be a laborer for them and help them run their administrative zone in the Soviet Union, you could be deported into Germany to do work for them there. Or you could be recruited into one of the sort of units of the army that the Germans are setting up to try and get certain Soviet groups to fight alongside them against Stalin. So those like Caucasian people I mentioned, the Turkfolker, like there are brigades for them set up. Cossacks, another group of Soviet people, they have their own battalions. Maybe the most famous example is there's this Soviet General Vlasov who is captured. He agrees to work with the Germans. He starts recruiting people, and he gets some of those recruits out of these POW camps. So, not everyone who goes into a POW camp will have the same experience, because not everyone has the same opportunity to be potentially recruited or pulled out, but some do. And so some end up joining the German system. Given how horrible the camps were, I think it's really hard for us to judge whether anyone who did that is following their ideological heart or whatever, like is being guided by, you know, a shared belief in German values, or just wants to get out of a camp. But as time goes on, that, you know, the longer that these former POWs spend doing stuff with the Germans, we can kind of maybe get a sense of like how committed are they, how interested are they really. And the last thing I'll say, another group that gets recruited out of POW camps are concentration camp guards. A lot of people who end up supporting the Germans as they carry out the Holocaust, they recruit from these Soviet POW camps to try and find them and train them too. So it's a way out for some of them, but not most of them. And so, yeah, so the very last thing I want to say is to come back to what I said at the beginning. We don't understand this group, this experience, certainly as well as we understand what happened to other kinds of POWs and other groups subjected to German atrocities. And so why not? And I think the short answer is lack of sources. Given what I just described about the camps, it's probably not surprising. These were not environments where the Soviet soldiers themselves were in any position to create sources. They're not writing letters. They're not writing diaries. They're not creating sort of anything to describe their experience. Those sketches I showed were made by people who survived, and they did those sketches after they're out of a camp to try and like remember what it was like. So people are not creating sources in these camps, and there's mass death. So many of the people who go through them don't live to talk about it. On the German side, when the end of the war comes, the Germans destroy a lot of the reports and the official documentation that they had created about these camps. I mean, I think they would maybe want to claim, you know, oh, in the chaos of war, things just happened. But it seems convenient that there's a lot of surviving documentation about, say, POW camps they ran in France, and there's almost none for the Soviet Union. So they make no effort to preserve any of these records, at least. And then after the war, unsurprisingly, Germans who were running these camps are, you know, soldiers, they don't want to talk about this. They don't want to talk about what they did to these POWs. What's maybe more surprising is on the Soviet side, Stalin's government also doesn't want to talk about this topic. Even before the war is over, they are discouraging Soviet POW survivors from discussing this, from like writing memoirs or anything. And I think it's because it's a real point of embarrassment for the Soviets, how many of their soldiers got captured. They tended to talk about these men and women as traitors. They let themselves get captured. This is the kind of language that the Soviets use. But I think that that's at least in part to try and cover up the fact that the Soviet state did such a bad job of keeping these people safe. And it's very embarrassing to acknowledge how many of these people died. And then the Cold War starts, and it only exacerbates this divide where the West doesn't want to see any Soviets as victims. They don't want to ask questions about this. And the Soviets, again, if they see this as a symbol of their weakness during the war, they don't want to acknowledge how many people died in World War II in the Soviet Union to begin with. That's classified information. So it just becomes a thing that isn't discussed really on either side until the fall of communism in the 1990s, the fall of the Soviet Union, when archives open up and we start to get access to some more material. But even then, there's not that much. So it's been a real sort of a fight for the last 25 to 35 years to try and figure out, like, how can we tell this story? How can we as historians understand what happened. And that's sort of what I'm trying to work through right now. And what I've found so far, the big thing that let me start this project and let me feel like, oh, maybe we can do it, is that the Soviets had an investigative commission that they created during the war that trailed behind the Red Army as it liberated territory, gathering information about what the Germans had done while they were on Soviet soil. And they have sort of twin goals. They want to gather up like a list of how much stuff was destroyed, because they're going to send a bill to the Germans later. And then they want to gather stories of atrocities because they're anticipating a future Nuremberg-style international trial. The Allies are already talking about this behind the scenes. So this commission goes around investigating, gathers a ton, like literally millions of pages of documentation of what the Germans did. The Soviets use a bit of it at Nuremberg, and then most of it just gets locked away and classified. And this becomes available to researchers in the 2010s. And we've been sorting through it for ages, but I recently sort of discovered that a bunch of it does relate to Soviet prisoners of war. And that's what has let me feel like, oh, I think there is enough material out there we could do something. And so my research uses that, and then I'm trying to combine it with whatever stuff I can find from the German side. I just got back from a research trip in Germany. I was just in the military archives searching for stuff. And as you can see from what I presented, photographs are becoming a thing that I'm really trying to draw on. There's not a lot of written material, but a lot of Germans took pictures of Soviet POWs, and we can get info from that. And then there is a little bit of material that's created post-fall of communism, some memoirs, some people writing about what it was like to be in a POW camp if they survived it. So that's where I'll end off. That's what we've got to go on.
Well, brilliant stuff. And to expand on what you said there, not only to find out the information, but also what can we learn from this to understand the wider war? Because as we talked with Richard this afternoon and Dallas and Ed this week, it's separating operational military history from POW history, from Holocaust history is not the way to go when you study the Eastern Front. They are all completely connected. And so to understand one, you have to understand the others. So, well, we've got a few questions for you, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
First, a couple of comments, just people saying how good it was. Your research is outstanding.
Oh, thank you.
It is important, etc., etc. Richard Hargreaves, who was on this afternoon, has come back. There are a couple of diaries, collections of letters of German officers who served in and possibly commanded camps in 1941. So maybe that's something you don't have or do have. I'll put the two of you in touch because none of us have everything.
Absolutely. That's great. That's great. I will just say, actually, one of the things I found just a few weeks ago in the military archives was a diary from someone who was administering one of these POW camps. He's writing about what he did every day. And I was so excited. But then I also found out he took over 2,000 photos. So he also documented these camps with images. So I'm super excited to dig into that guy's stuff. But yeah, that's
brilliant. Yeah, and I'm glad you said about it came up in the sidebar as well about the traitor kind of mentality of the treatment of these guys. Whereas I'm thinking about, for example, in Australia, people that have been captives in Changi or the Burma Railway, they were like encouraged. There were all sorts of serializations in newspapers for years after. Come, tell us how badly you were treated. Tell us about the brutality there. So it was a sort of almost not a celebration, but a public demand to hear about what these people have been through, and then rightly treat them as the heroes they were. But anyway, we'll do the question. So, well, this is another comment there from Otto. Being a Soviet POW in 1941 in particular was one of the worst fates for anyone in the whole of World War II. Hard to disagree with that point.
Yeah, I mean, I would always point out, because as someone who thinks of herself as both a historian of the Soviet Union, World War II, and the Holocaust, that's absolutely accurate. But if you are on top of that, if you're Jewish and you're a Soviet POW, then any case, being Jewish is like the worst thing to add onto any of the
storm of everything bad. Yeah. Interesting question from Ian Carr there about, do you think there's a common denominator on the Soviet POWs that survived? Because people have done that sort of work with Holocaust survivors. Is there a mental state? Is there, obviously not getting diseases and having a certain level of fitness will help, but is there something more sort of, I don't know, ethereal that you can point to is what got people through?
I don't think we know enough at this point to say definitively. I think the best thing we could say at this point would be to point to all of the things that, if you're not part of certain groups. That's just the best situation you could be in. So as you say, not coming into a camp already injured, there's not going to be treatment. So you're in big trouble if you come in with like a wound that needs, antibiotics or something. Not coming in already with a weakened immune system, that's probably not going to set you up for success. But then there's these idea, because race is so important to the Germans, if you are lucky enough to be in one of the groups that they think of as a higher race, you've got a much better shot of surviving, not being a woman. So basically, I think so much of the Soviet experience comes down to chance, because disease and like starvation are not discriminating. But if you pair it with, the Germans are discriminating in a bad way. So being in one of those racial groups the Germans are more willing to work with, it gives you a much higher chance. Also, I focused on the Soviet POWs who spend their time in camps on Soviet soil. That's what I'm really interested in with my research, because that's what we understand the least of all the options. Some get shipped into Germany to do labor, and they end up having a better time because the Germans don't want starving people around the German civilians. So they get fed more food so that they don't pass disease on. So if you ended up in Germany to work, you are probably more likely to survive the war than if you stayed in a POW camp in the Soviet Union.
Wow. Which sounds sort of counterintuitive, but thank you for that. Great question. I don't know, you got off from Stephen there about, you see, the thing about the Third Reich is they do keep a record of everything in their paperwork. We know obviously the Soviets rapidly saw with their own eyes what was happening to their people on the front there. But did any of the kind of official orders that you reference ever find their way into Soviet hands? I mean, probably post-war, but during the war, did the Soviets ever realize just quite how organized this was?
Yeah, I think they did. So a large amount of German documentation does fall into Soviet hands, and the Soviets try and use that. They present stuff they captured at Nuremberg. Like they publish a lot of it during the war. What they encounter is a problem of their own making, which is that they were known for twisting everything and making it propaganda. And so they are not considered a trustworthy source by most of the world. They're also not considered a trustworthy source by their own population necessarily. And so even when they're publishing this in Soviet newspapers saying like, oh, things are so terrible, some of their own people are like, well, you can't trust what Stalin says. So like, I don't know about that. So they encounter this issue where, they have sort of undermined their own credibility, and not everyone believes this. They think they're exaggerating because some of the stuff just sounds so impossibly horrible. They're like, well, it can't really be that. But also, before the war is even over, the Soviets have decided, they start downplaying discussions of atrocities because, again, they think it makes them look weak. So they don't like to talk about their own soldiers suffering because they know their own soldiers who have to keep fighting. That's not good morale. That's not good motivation. So they don't actually, they talk at the beginning of the war when they're trying to get the world to like help them. We've been invaded, like come, Stalin wants a second front. So when they're trying to get the Allies to do that, they talk a bit about it. But as time goes on, they're keeping records for themselves for sure, but they actually don't publish it as much because they sort of realize like, this is not motivating our soldiers to fight very effectively, actually.
Yeah. I mean, who'd have thought that the autocratic, terrible regimes might end up people casting doubts over the accuracy of their information? I mean,
what a shock, right?
What a shock, mind-blowing. So the question came up, which was partly answered by Dallas in the sidebar and Richard Hargreaves in the sidebar, about obviously the Red Cross don't have access to these places, but are there any German medical personnel who are raising questions? Now, as I understand it, the German medical officers during the Third Reich had not signed the Hippocratic Oath as we know it today. But if you're a doctor or and you're seeing this, surely you're going to, well, no, I'll say surely. I would like to think they would raise questions and go, shit, we can't do this.
Yeah. There doesn't seem to be evidence of that happening on a large scale. But I will say a thing I encountered in the archives in Berlin just last week was a report that was written by a member of the SD, so one of these very Nazified troops, complaining to supervisors in Berlin that he had just had an interaction with an officer running one of these POW camps, and basically saying the officer gave me a hard time. The officer didn't want to hand over these troops to me, these Red Army troops to me, so I could kill them. And he quotes the officer saying, you can't just commit mass murder. Like, that's the direct quote. And then he's like, this guy has a bad attitude. He needs to be fired. And so there were Germans, we know from moments like this, there were Germans who saw that this was this was not okay, who did not want to be participating in this, who were trying to do more to protect these Red Army soldiers. But they are not only not being supported by the wider structure of the military and the Nazi sort of state, they're sometimes getting in trouble for it, or at least, getting reprimanded.
It's that modern thing of speaking out in an institution where you yourself are then worried about your own career path, your own opportunities, the whistleblower syndrome, I guess, in some ways. So
I'll just also, if I can, just say one more thing. It's a plug for a great book. There are not a lot of sources, especially in English, that deal with this topic, but there is a really great book that came out about a decade ago called Reluctant Accomplice, which is a collection of translated letters from a German soldier who served in one of these units that helped run a POW camp in the Soviet Union. And it's called Reluctant Accomplice because he is participating in the system, but he's writing home to his wife, basically expressing a lot of concern. And like, he doesn't like it. He doesn't want to be doing. He's trying to get access to more food for these POWs, but he can't. He's being stymied by just the general shortages. So again, like, we know there are these lone voices that were speaking out against it, pushing back as much as they could, but it was within a system that was just, this is why it matters that the system is sort of set up so poorly, because a few people didn't have the power to push back against this on their own. Yeah.
Couple more, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Ian Carger is, did Soviet partisans interfere with these POW camps, or rather expanding on that, if they're near somewhere, getting food across or trying to arrange a breakout? I mean, we've had the discussions about the fact that the Allies proposed, bombing Auschwitz, that kind of thing. But was there anything internally within the Soviet Union? Is like, can we do something about this ourselves?
I think not on an organized scale. The Soviet partisans, especially as the war goes on and they're more organized and more like working with the state and the military, this is not their focus. There are scattered instances where we do see this. So I'll say, going back again to my research in Rostov-on-Don, there were multiple POW camps there. There were also small, isolated partisan units that set themselves up in this city, like just tiny numbers of people. They're not really connected because they're in an occupied city. They're not really connected to the larger infrastructure. But one of the things that the most successful partisan unit in Rostov-on-Don does is sends some women into a camp, basically saying like, hey, we want to trade vegetables. Like, let us bring some food to these guys. And they kind of like bribe their way into the camp. And then they get in contact with some of them and they arrange a breakout for like maybe 10 or 12 guys who end up breaking out of that POW camp. And then they have to hide them in the city until the occupation is over. So like really small scale things were possible. But I think in general, partisan units were focused on trying to disrupt the Germans militarily.
The direct attempt against the war effort, yeah.
Yeah, and as tragic as it is, I mean, we also thinking about partisans don't really do a lot to help during the Holocaust either. And I think there's this sense that is not unrealistic, but is kind of tragic, that like, okay, if we break these people out of a ghetto or a POW camp, what do we do with them? They would have to come like live with us in our partisan, hideout in the forest. And like, they're not fighters, or at least POWs have a better chance of being rehabilitated back to health. And maybe they could be. So they're probably, the partisans would favor, helping those guys. But they don't see themselves usually as having the infrastructure to like support unwell people. So it's,
And I guess it connects when we had the discussions back in March and April about Eisenhower's broad front strategy, that the considered opinion was the best way to help people who are suffering is to bring the war to an end via direct military means, rather than trying to sort of start some humanitarian thing on the side of that with limit. And I don't know that I completely buy that argument, but I understand that that's what the prevailing thought was at the time.
Yeah, I also feel like does it have to be either or? Is there really nothing we can do in the meantime?
By 44 with the resources, you can maybe, do both.
Hope. But at the same time, I think it is true that, like, certainly if you're in a POW camp that's sort of deepest into the occupied territories, which will in turn mean you're being liberated earlier because those are the territories that are reclaimed first, like that's another thing that's going to increase your chance of survival, is just the luck of like, the less time you spend in a POW camp, the better your chances of surviving a POW camp. So, you know, getting people out of enemy control is the number one best way to, you know, prevent atrocities. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. And then the last question, when you talked about the women who were captured, and thank you for making sure, reminding us of that aspect there. Jim asked about, was there also increased prejudice because of the fear of inbreeding? You know, the Germans through whatever means, you know, getting Russian women pregnant.
Yeah. I think that one would expect that would be part of it. I'm not sure that is at the forefront of their concern. I think if you look at the way the Germans talk about, and the sort of like terrible nicknames they give to these female fighters, even female partisans, if I had to sort of try and pick apart what's going on, I think there's more of a fear of German women getting ideas about what women could be doing, and like challenging the gender order within Germany in that way. I think that's maybe like really at the heart of what they're afraid of, because the Germans do set up military brothels as part of their occupation structure in the Soviet Union. And in some places they staff them with local Soviet women, and like they tell their soldiers to go to these brothels. They set up scenarios where their soldiers are having sex with Soviet people. They're also, of course, that's a controlled scenario. They don't expect pregnancies to result. They can deal with it if pregnancies come up. But I think there's so much sexual violence. There's so much sexual contact that is actually happening in practice, that I think it's more a sense of like, the world only works in the structure we've set up if women have a certain place and men have a different place. And we just can't have any evidence that that's challengeable. We can't have any evidence that a woman could be a successful soldier, because the whole structure we're building this new Third Reich on would really fall apart.
We're back to ideology again, and we've discussed this so much on this channel, is that it's both deciding everything, but it's also their own weakest link in that if theoretically the Germans see the Russian the Soviet model of using women, more women could be starting to work in factories, because that's the one thing the Germans are, well, they're shit at many things in World War II, but mobilizing women for the war effort is something they're very late in the game compared to Britain. And so
it's not accidental.
Help them win the war.
Yeah.
If they mobilized, I mean, I know people say, well, there were women in the Luftwaffe. Yes, of course, but not on the scales that there are in Britain, for example, or Canada, or
and similar. Looking at pragmatism versus ideology in the occupied Soviet territories, they could have gotten so much more buy-in, so much more cooperation from locals who were unhappy with the communist system, if they had just toned down the killing and the starvation, like toned down the atrocities. And they wouldn't be Nazis. They wouldn't be, Germans raised.
This is, in a weird way, you kind of have to not admire them, but they did stick rigidly to their ridiculous, evil, disgusting policies. That thing in.
They really believed it, I think, is what it comes back to. Yeah.
The not sending the train from Paris of wounded NCOs who could be patched up and go back in the front to delay the Allies, but making sure the deportees are on the train, going that ridiculous thing they're doing, where they're going, okay, there's an option here of trying to make the war still a viable possibility, or no, we're just always, it's doubling down. I always say that's the phrase, they double down on the ideology all the time. It's ridiculous, as well as being disgusting.
They don't just want to win the war; they want to win the war in a specific ideologically.
They have to win it that way, otherwise it doesn't count.
It's not worth it to them.
Well, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. The praise coming in the sidebar is deserved, and I think I would extend an invitation for you to come back and do something else later on, because
I would love to.
As someone said earlier on, the discussions we've had this week, they'll be thinking about them all weekend. They said, well, I will say to people, have a bit of a break, watch a comedy film as well. Walk the dog. Don't just get stuck in the loop of just considering the awful stuff of World War II. But yes, I'm glad that the content we're creating is resonating with people. So thank you very much. The link, as I say, to the book is in the description below. You can check out Maris's work elsewhere on the internet. Thank you, Dallas, in the sidebar. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everybody else. But right now, this is Paul Woodadge from World War II TV saying, enjoy your weekend. I'll see you on Monday for Norwegian. Well, it's Danish convicts. Anders Lassen, SAS, on Monday. Lots of myth busting coming your way with Thomas. Anyway, thanks everybody. I will see you all next time. Cheers for watching. Bye.